Anyone inside the house needs to verify their own residency, and if they can't, that's an emergency removal situation. The words arrived with the casual, almost bored delivery of someone reading from a policy manual they had written themselves, and they landed in the warm Saturday morning air of the driveway at 4117 Maplewood Court the way a blade lands, not with noise, but with the specific, irreversible sensation of something having been cut. The officer who said them was standing with his right hand resting near his duty belt sunglasses on, despite the angle of the morning light. His voice carrying the flat, unconcerned quality of a man who has found the lever he was looking for and intends to use it without hurry, without apology, without any particular awareness that he has just made the most consequential mistake of his professional life. The man he was speaking to did not respond immediately. He stood in paint-splattered work pants and a faded Howard University tee, a chamois cloth folded over his left hand, the chrome of a 1969 Chevelle SS gleaming in the morning light behind him. And he let the words settle through him the way cold settles through a building at night, slowly, completely into every room. And what happened inside him in those 4 or 5 seconds of absolute stillness was not rage, because rage was a luxury, and luxuries were things the situation could not afford. What happened was something colder and more permanent than rage. From inside the house, through the front door that stood between him and everything he had spent 30 years building, he could hear his wife moving in the kitchen, the particular rhythm of her Saturday morning, the sound of a second cup of coffee being poured, the soft half-hum of a song she didn't know she was singing. He listened to that sound and he made a decision. And the decision was not about this morning, and was not about this officer, and was not about the driveway, or the car, or the work pants that didn't match it. The decision was about the whole architecture of it. Every complaint that had been filed and buried. Every person who had been told that their experience was insufficient for action, and the decision was that it ended here today in a way that outlasted the driveway. 3 hours earlier, Cedarwood Heights, on a Saturday morning in July, had the particular quality of a neighborhood that has fully committed to the weekend, the kind of unhurried domestic peace that arrives when a street full of people have all independently decided that nothing urgent is going to happen to them today, and have arranged their lives accordingly. Sprinklers ticked across manicured lawns in the slow rotating arcs that had been ticking across lawns in this neighborhood since the early 1980s, and the smell of someone's bacon drifted from an open kitchen window 2 houses down with the cheerful democratic generosity of a smell that doesn't ask permission before entering your morning. A pair of mockingbirds conducted their ongoing territorial dispute in the ancient live oak that anchored the corner of Dorothy Reeves's property, their bickering carrying that cheerful, indignant quality that made it genuinely impossible to take seriously, and somewhere around the bend of the cul-de-sac a child was attempting to ride a training wheel bicycle down the slight slope of the sidewalk, the aluminum frame scraping the asphalt in unsteady, determined arcs that suggested the child had been at this for a while and had decided that mastery was not optional. Raymond Holt stood in his driveway in a pair of paint-splattered work pants that had survived 3 garage renovation projects, a grass-staining incident involving the back fence during the summer of 2019, and one particularly ill-advised attempt at refinishing the hardwood floors in the den that had ended with Sandra standing in the doorway saying absolutely nothing, which had been worse than anything she could have said. The pants were beyond saving as anything presentable, which made them exactly right for the task at hand. His shirt was a faded Howard University tee, the bison logo cracked and softened by 2 decades of washing, until the cotton had achieved that ideal worn-in texture that makes expensive new shirts feel like a kind of fraud. On his feet were a pair of old canvas sneakers, the right one bearing a permanent streak of sapphire green paint along the toe from the afternoon 6 months ago when the Chevelle's final color had been applied and Raymond had been standing too close to the spray line. The Chevelle sat on the concrete in the morning light with the particular presence of a vehicle that has been brought back from the dead, and Raymond paused with the chamois cloth in his hand and just looked at it for a moment, the way a man looks at something he has made from almost nothing. The 1969 Chevrolet Chevelle. SS midnight green chrome bumpers polished to the standard of a man who considers polishing them each Saturday morning something between meditation and prayer. He had found the car 11 years ago at an estate sale in East Garland. A widow selling off 40 years of her late husband's accumulated passions, the Chevelle buried under tarps in the back corner of a detached garage. Its engine missing its body, riddled with rust. Its paint so faded it looked less like a color than a memory of one. He had restored it over 6 years, working only on weekends and the occasional evening sourcing parts from specialists in 3 different states, rebuilding the engine himself with the help of a retired machinist named Elton, who lived on the east block of the neighborhood and had strong opinions about carburetor specifications that Raymond had learned to receive without comment. The chamois cloth he was using this morning had been a birthday gift from his eldest daughter, embroidered in the corner with a small Howard bison, her private joke about her father's alma mater, and he set it carefully on the hood while he adjusted his grip on the sponge, the way you set down something that matters before you pick up something that requires both hands. Sandra appeared in the doorway at 8:45 with a cup of coffee, the way she always did on Saturday mornings, housecoat reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead where they lived on weekends, an expression that occupied the pleasant territory somewhere between affection and resigned amusement that she had been directing at Raymond and his cars for 3 decades. "You know that car is cleaner than our kitchen floor," she said. "Our kitchen floor doesn't get compliments," Raymond said without looking up. She laughed, a short, warm sound, and then she turned back toward the door and said almost as an afterthought that Gerald Odom across the street had mentioned upgrading his security cameras last week. The new one's 4K resolution said he could read a license plate from his porch. Raymond filed the information away without thinking about it the way you file away things that don't seem to need a folder yet. Raymond Holt was 47 years old and had been an officer of the Garland City Police Department for 22 years, started as a patrol officer at 25, made detective at 31, which his mother had called finally, and his father, who drove a city bus for 30 years, had received with a slow nod and 2 words: "Good. Watch your back." He had made detective sergeant at 38, leading the Major Crimes Division in a unit that closed its cases at a rate that had drawn 2 commendations from the chief's office and the quiet professional respect of people who understood what the numbers meant. He had been passed over for lieutenant twice, and he had accepted it, not without bitterness, but with the pragmatic clarity of a man who has learned the difference between the fight worth having and the fight that costs more than it returns. He had asked for the transfer to Major Crimes, buried himself in the work, and decided that the view from the place he had carved out for himself was better than the chair someone else had decided he wasn't supposed to sit in. The house at the end of Maplewood Court. 4 bedrooms, covered porch backyard, deep enough that the neighbor's noise became theoretical, had taken him and Sandra 14 years to afford, and the morning he turned the key in the front door lock. For the first time, something in his chest settled that he hadn't known was still waiting to settle. He owned the house, he owned the car, he owned the Saturday morning, and there was not a single thing about any of it that had been given to him. Officer Kyle Brandt turned his patrol cruiser onto Maplewood Court at 9:47 on a Saturday morning with the loose, comfortable authority of a man who has never genuinely questioned his right to be anywhere, the kind of authority that has never been tested by anything serious enough to require it to be real. He was 39 years old, platinum blonde hair kept military short, and just past its last trim with a jaw that looked specifically engineered for argument and eyes behind his sunglasses that moved across a landscape the way a metal detector moves across a beach, not expecting nothing but calibrated to find something and genuinely dissatisfied until it did. He had been on the Garland City Police Department for 11 years, which was long enough to have developed very settled opinions about how the world worked and who belonged where within it, and not quite long enough to have faced any consequence serious enough to disturb those opinions. He adjusted his sunglasses with one deliberate finger as he turned onto the residential street, a small habitual gesture he made whenever he was entering a situation he intended to control, and let his eyes move down the cul-de-sac in the slow proprietary sweep of a man surveying territory he considers his. His transfer to the Cedarwood Heights patrol sector 8 months ago had been described in departmental language as a mutually agreed reassignment following a review of Officer Brandt's assignment compatibility with his current precinct environment, which was the specific kind of language that the Garland City PD used when the truth was too legally inconvenient to print on official paperwork. The truth was that Captain Lewis of the East Side Precinct had spent 7 months documenting Brandt's behavior with the patience of a man building a case, and had finally told the district commander that he would not continue to absorb the liability. 3 use-of-force complaints in 30 months, all involving black male civilians, all closed before reaching formal review, all carrying the fingerprints of someone intervening on Brandt's behalf at the precise moment the process should have proceeded. That someone was Dale Fenwick, the police union representative, a man who had made a particular specialty of guiding complaints to the edge of formal review and then quietly steering them into the filing cabinet where careers were protected and paperwork went to age without consequence. Brandt knew Fenwick the way certain people know their insurance agent, not with genuine warmth, but with the comfortable reliance of someone who has made a claim before and found the process smooth. 3 days before this Saturday, Brandt had been in the precinct locker room talking about his transfer to Cedarwood Heights with the uncensored ease of a man speaking to someone he assumed shared his worldview, saying that rich neighborhoods got complacent, that he intended to shake the trees in his new sector, that he knew exactly what kind of people to look for, using words that belonged to a different era, but that he used with the casual comfort of someone who had never been required to update his vocabulary. He did not notice that Officer Tamara Reeves, 28 years old, was still lacing her boots in the far corner of the room when he started talking, and he did not notice that her hand had gone very still beside her boot, in the particular stillness of someone who has just decided to do something. This morning, his patrol partner had called in sick, and Brandt was running solo, and he had not reported this to dispatch before beginning his patrol one of the small procedural corners he had been cutting since the transfer, because corners existed to be cut when no one significant was watching. He turned onto Maplewood Court, and his eyes found the driveway at the end of the cul-de-sac, with the efficiency of a man whose assumptions had been doing his seeing for him for years. He processed the scene in the way he had been processing scenes for 11 years, the neighborhood affluent and quiet. The car, a restored Chevelle SS in midnight green, the kind of vehicle that suggested either old money or professional income or something else depending on who was standing behind it. And the man, black, broad-shouldered, in worn work clothes, leaning into the driver's side with a cloth in his hand. The man's clothes did not match the car, and in Brandt's particular calculus, that mismatch was the entire case. He sat in the cruiser for 117 seconds, watching Raymond Holt wash his car before he reached for the emergency lights. No radio call to dispatch, just the silent, aggressive strobing of the light bar painting the oak trees in frantic blue and red and turned the cruiser into the driveway blocking the exit. 4 years before the July morning on Maplewood Court, on a different street on the east side of Garland, a man named James Tate was washing his truck in front of the duplex he had rented for 6 years, and it was a Saturday morning, very much like this one, the light warm and unhurried, a radio playing through the open window of his kitchen, the specific quiet pleasure of a man doing something ordinary in the place where he lives. James was 40 years old that summer, a school bus driver for the Garland Unified School District. A man who woke at 5:15 every weekday morning and drove the Route 7 loop through the East Side neighborhoods picking up children whose names he knew, whose after-school programs he tracked, whose parents flagged him down at the stop to ask if their kid had seemed all right on the ride home. He had been driving Route 7 for 9 years, and the work had settled into him the way good work settles, not glamorous, not noticed, but real in the specific way that things are real when they matter to people who depend on them. The truck was a 10-year-old Silverado with 140,000 miles on it and a small dent in the rear quarter panel from a parking lot incident in 2017 that James had accepted as part of the vehicle's biography. He washed it every other Saturday with the practical care of a man who understands that things you maintain last longer than things you don't. filling a bucket from the hose working from the roof down the soapy water running in rivulets across the paint and pooling at the base of the driveway. A few doors down, 2 kids from the building were on their bikes, doing slow figure eights in the street, calling to each other in the easy, argumentative way of children who have run out of new things to disagree about and have circled back to the old ones. James had waved at them when he came out. They had waved back. It was a Saturday morning, and it was his, and there was nothing complicated about any of it. The cruiser appeared at the end of the block at 9:12 and moved slowly, too slowly for a car with somewhere to be down the center of the residential street, and James registered it in the peripheral way you register things that don't yet require your full attention. He kept working the soapy mitt across the hood of the Silverado. The cruiser stopped at his driveway. The officer who stepped out was Kyle Brandt, 35 years old, 7 years on the force at that point. Platinum blonde hair and the jaw and the sunglasses and the adjustment of the sunglasses with one deliberate finger as he crossed the sidewalk toward James's driveway. A gesture that James would remember clearly 3 years later when he was sitting in front of a yellow legal pad trying to write down every detail he could recall for the complaint form. Morning, Brandt said. "Whose truck is this?" James had looked at him with the specific, patient expression of a man who has encountered this particular variety of question before and has developed a protocol for receiving it without losing his composure. "Mine," he said. "Is there a problem?" There was a conversation that followed, and it went the way those conversations go when one person has authority and the other has rights, and neither party is confused about which is which, but only one of them has the power to act on it. Brandt wanted identification. James asked what the suspicion was. Brandt said he'd had a report of someone in the area matching James's description acting suspiciously near vehicles. James asked what the report said specifically, and Brandt said that wasn't information he was required to share. When James did not immediately comply with Brandt's instruction to step away from the truck, Brandt's hand went to James's arm with the rough, purposeful grip of a man who has done this before and has learned that the contact itself tends to produce compliance even when the words haven't, and James pulled back not aggressively, just the natural physical response of a person who has been grabbed without cause, and Brandt called it resistance. The children on their bikes had stopped at the edge of the driveway and were watching. James filed the complaint 8 days later, typed detailed 3 pages with the name and contact information of a neighbor who had been watering her plants on her front stoop and had seen the entire encounter. He submitted it to the department's civilian complaint intake office and received an acknowledgement email confirming receipt and assigning a case number. 6 weeks later, a letter arrived. After review, the matter has been determined to present insufficient grounds for formal disciplinary proceedings. The complaint is hereby closed. James called the number on the letter. A woman told him the decision was final, but that he could appeal through the Community Liaison Office. He went to the Community Liaison Office on a Thursday afternoon after his route. The man there was sympathetic and told him these things moved slowly and that he would follow up. James did not hear from him again. He tried to tell the story a few more times to a neighbor, to his sister on the phone one evening, to a colleague at the bus depot who nodded with the weary recognition of a man who has heard this story before because he has lived a version of it himself. And then James stopped telling it because he had discovered something that surprised him with how much it hurt. Being disbelieved or being believed, but told there was nothing to be done, was worse than carrying the thing alone. Carrying it alone was just a weight. Telling it and being turned away was a different kind of damage, the kind that made you smaller in a way that was hard to name and harder to recover. He folded the closed complaint letter and put it in the kitchen drawer on top of his Route 7 roster and underneath an old phone bill, and he went on driving his route and learning his kids' names and letting the story calcify into something he simply carried and did not examine. On a Monday morning in July, 4 years later, his phone would ring with a number he did not recognize, and a woman would tell him she was calling from the Garland City PD Internal Affairs Civilian Review Unit, and she would tell him she had his file, and she would ask if he was willing to come in. But that was 4 years away. And on this Saturday morning, James Tate folded the complaint letter and put it in the drawer, and he went back inside and made a cup of coffee, and the letter sat in the dark with the particular patience of things that are waiting to matter. Raymond heard the cruiser door open from across the driveway and registered it the way he registered things that belonged to a category he had been trained to notice the specific creak of a loaded duty belt settling as the officer stood the weight of the footsteps on the concrete, the particular unhurried pace of someone who is not approaching with service in mind. He set the chamois cloth down on the hood of the Chevelle, the one with the embroidered Howard bison in the corner, his daughter's birthday gift from 2 years ago, and he set it down with a care that was deliberate, the way you set down something that belongs to one part of your life before you step into a different part of it. And then he turned around. The officer was white, late 30s, platinum blonde hair, military short, a jaw arranged in the particular configuration of muscle and certainty that Raymond, in 22 years of reading people in situations where misreading them had consequences, had come to classify quickly and accurately. The name tag read Brant. The sunglasses hid the eyes, but the jaw told him enough, and what it told him was not that this was a man who was curious or uncertain or cautious. It told him that this was a man who had already decided, and that whatever he had decided before he got out of the cruiser. Raymond's hands were at his sides, open visible. He had learned the habit of visible hands before he had learned long division. Learned it from a father who had learned it from his father, who had understood that there was a curriculum that black children in this country received alongside their other education, running parallel to mathematics and reading and science. A curriculum that was never written down and was never taught in a classroom, and that you needed to know anyway because not knowing it could get you killed. "Afternoon, Officer Raymond," said his voice carrying the calm, unhurried quality of a man with no particular urgency in any direction. "Is there a problem?" "Step away from the vehicle." Raymond took one deliberate step back from the Chevelle, keeping his hands where they were visible. "I'm away from the car. What can I do for you?" "Whose car is this?" Raymond looked at the chamois cloth on the hood at the bucket of soapy water beside his left foot at the garden hose coiled on the concrete, the full and obvious assembly of a man in the middle of washing a car. And then he looked back at Brant with the measured patience of someone who has decided that patience is the instrument the moment requires. "Mine," he said. "And what are you doing with it?" "I'm washing it," Raymond said. "I would think that's fairly obvious." Something shifted behind the sunglasses. Not surprise exactly. Something closer to the specific irritation of a man who was expecting a different kind of response and is recalibrating for one he didn't prepare for. Brant adjusted his sunglasses with one deliberate finger the second time Raymond had seen him make that gesture in less than 90 seconds and stepped closer. "This is a very expensive vehicle for someone dressed like that," Brant said, and the words landed with the casual, almost absent quality of a phrase that has been used enough times that the speaker no longer registers its specific cruelty. It came out of him the way breathing comes out without thought, without effort, without any apparent awareness that he had just said out loud what a better man would have kept to himself. Raymond felt the familiar sting of it. Not new, not shocking, but never not there, and he felt it move through him the way he had taught himself over 22 years, to let it move through him, metabolized quickly so that it did not have time to become something that showed on his face or lived in his hands. And in the same moment that he felt it, he made the decision. He was not going to show the badge. Not yet. Not because he was afraid, and not because he was uncertain, but because he was a detective. And what a detective does before making an arrest is gather evidence, and he wanted to see the full and complete shape of what Kyle Brant was before Rank entered the room and changed the calculation. He wanted to see how this man treated a man he believed to be without protection, without recourse, without the institutional weight of a gold shield to throw on the scale. He wanted the whole case clean and uninterrupted, and he intended to have it. Dorothy Reeves had been pulling weeds from the bed along her front fence when the patrol cruiser turned onto Maplewood Court, and she had straightened up and watched it with the specific focused attention of a woman who has lived on this street for 23 years and understands that a police cruiser moving at that particular speed at that particular hour on a Saturday morning is not a neutral event. She was 72 years old with the upright, unhurried posture of someone who spent 30 years teaching 7th grade English and had never entirely shed the physical authority of a person accustomed to managing a room full of 12-year-olds who were all simultaneously convinced they didn't want to be there. She had folded her arms across her chest, her reading glasses hanging from the chain around her neck, and she had watched the cruiser pull into Raymond's driveway and block the exit, and she had watched the officer get out, and she had watched the conversation begin with the expression of a woman who has seen this resolved badly before more than once on more than one street, and who had decided on this particular Saturday morning that she was not going to look away. Her grandson Calvin was 16 years old and visiting for the weekend a broad-shouldered boy with his grandmother's careful eyes and the particular energy of a teenager who had not yet decided what to do with all the things he was noticing about the world, but was noticing them very clearly. He had been walking Dorothy's old retriever mix down the opposite sidewalk when the lights activated on the cruiser, and he had stopped at the edge of the pavement, the dog sitting patiently at his feet, and he had watched for approximately 30 seconds before he reached for his phone. He started recording at the moment he saw the officer reposition himself between Raymond and the front door of the house, an action with no legitimate purpose that Calvin, at 16 years old with no legal training and no law enforcement background, nevertheless recognized immediately as what it was. He lifted the phone and held it steady, and the retriever sat beside him in the morning heat, and Calvin did not blink. Across the cul-de-sac, the front window of Gerald Odom's house offered a clear view of the entire driveway, and Gerald was standing at it with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and the expression of a man who is watching something he does not like and is already doing the mental math about what he should do about it. Gerald was 62, a retired contractor with the unhurried practicality of someone who has spent 40 years solving problems by identifying exactly what they are, and he had had the new 4K security cameras installed 3 weeks ago, the wide-angle lens above his porch capturing the entire cul-de-sac at a resolution that, as he had mentioned to Sandra Holt just last week, was sharp enough to read a license plate from his front steps. The camera was running now as it ran every day, indifferent and thorough, recording everything. Raymond, for his part, was watching Brandt walk back to the cruiser to run the Chevelle's plates. He was positioned at the right angle to see the reflection in the passenger window, and he watched Brandt read the clean return on the mobile data terminal, watched him sit with it for 7 or 8 seconds, watched the specific quality of stillness that belongs to a man receiving information that contradicts his assumptions and choosing to proceed anyway. And then Brandt climbed back out. Vehicle comes back. "Registered," Brandt said, approaching the driveway again, his voice carrying the smooth, manufactured confidence of someone who has learned that a new justification stated with enough certainty tends to go unchallenged. "I still need to verify occupancy of the residence. There's been a pattern of people presenting fraudulent documentation, occupying properties under false pretenses. I'm going to need you to step away from the property while I conduct a welfare check." Raymond looked at him. "Step away from my own property?" Raymond said, his voice quiet and precise, "So you can conduct a welfare check on my home." "Standard procedure," Brandt said, "when occupancy cannot be verified." And then he moved between Raymond and the front door of the house, placing his body between a man and his own home with the casual, deliberate physicality of someone who has learned that movement can make an argument that words cannot. And Raymond stood perfectly still and catalogued the move with the professional attention of a detective who has just been handed another piece of evidence. There is a kind of stillness that is not passivity, not surrender, not fear, not the stillness of a man who has run out of options, but the stillness of someone who has made a very clear decision about exactly where he is standing and has no intention of moving from it. And that was the stillness that Raymond Holt brought to the next several minutes of the confrontation on his driveway, a stillness so complete and so grounded that it seemed to have its own weight, its own gravity, its own specific effect on the space around it. He did not step back. He stood where he was and let Brandt move between him and the door, and he catalogued that move, added it to what he was building, and then he spoke. "Officer Brandt, He said the use of the name read directly from the tag was itself a small and deliberate signal I am paying attention. Everything is being recorded in my mind. Under the Fourth Amendment and the state stop and identify statutes, you cannot compel me to identify myself without reasonable and articulable suspicion that I have committed, am committing, or am about to commit a crime. Being a black man in work clothes next to a restored vehicle does not meet that legal standard, and I suspect you already know that. The statement settled into the driveway between them like a stone dropped into still water. And for a moment, something in the dynamic shifted. Not much, not enough, but there was a half-second where Brandt was genuinely still, his body receiving information that his mind was not quite sure what to do with. Because patrol officers did not often encounter civilians who deployed Terry stop precedent in driveway conversations on Saturday mornings, with the calm, unhurried delivery of someone reading from a text they had written themselves. To a different officer, that specificity might have been cause for recalibration, or at least for pause. But Brandt was not a different officer. "We got a lawyer here," he said, and the sneer in it was complete and ugly. He stepped forward again, closing the distance until Raymond could see his own reflection in the lenses of the sunglasses, and his voice dropped into the register that Raymond recognized immediately as the voice of a man who has located a threat and is choosing his words to stay technically on the right side of explicit. "I determine what's lawful here, not you. Give me your ID or we are going to have a very different kind of conversation." Raymond did not step back. He stood exactly where he was and measured what he could see in Brandt's body, the tightness in the shoulders, the flushed neck, the hand that kept returning to the vicinity of the duty belt. Like a habit the man couldn't break, and he kept building the case with the internal discipline of someone who has done this in rooms far more dangerous than a residential driveway on a Saturday morning. He formally requested a supervisor be dispatched to the scene. Brandt declined. He made the request again precisely for the benefit of every recording device and every witness on the street. Brandt declined again, and this time he reached for his radio not to call it in, just held the microphone between his fingers as a prop. The specific theater of implied consequence that is designed to communicate the possibility of things escalating without actually committing to making them escalate. Raymond noted the gesture. He noted the hesitation behind it. He noted everything. What he did not do through any of it was show what he was feeling, because what he was feeling was too large and too old and too deeply rooted in 22 years of carrying the specific weight of being exactly who he was, inside an institution that had never entirely decided how it felt about that. And none of that belonged in this driveway. None of it belonged on his face. None of it belonged anywhere except in the quiet internal accounting that he had been keeping since the moment the cruiser pulled in and blocked his exit. At the garden fence, Dorothy Reeves had stopped folding her arms and was now gripping the top rail with both hands, her knuckles pale against the wood, watching with the focused, unambiguous attention of a woman who has arrived at the point in a situation where ambiguity is no longer available. Calvin across the street had not lowered his phone. Raymond kept his hands visible. He kept his voice level. And inside the house behind the front door that Brandt was now standing between Raymond and Sandra Holt moved through her Saturday morning kitchen with the unaware ease of someone who does not yet know that the world outside her door has changed. The threat arrived in the specific voice of a man who has found his leverage and knows it not. Loud, not heated, but carrying the particular cold calculation of someone who has located the thing you cannot afford to lose and has decided to point at it deliberately. "Here's the thing," Brandt said, and his voice had shifted into a register that was different from everything that had come before it. Not the manufactured authority of his earlier demands, not the contemptuous sneer of the lawyer comment, but something quieter and more studied, the voice of someone who has moved past improvisation and into something planned. He reached for the radio on his shoulder, not to call anyone. Just held the mic between his fingers with the unhurried ease of a man handling a prop he has used before. "When I get a report about a suspicious person at a residence and I cannot verify occupancy, and the occupant is being uncooperative, there are protocols I'm required to follow. One of those protocols involves notifying city services for a safety check of anyone present in the building. He paused, and in the pause the morning continued around them. The sprinklers, the mockingbirds, the distant scrape of Calvin's grandmother's retriever on the sidewalk across the street, all of it unchanged, all of it entirely indifferent to what was happening in this driveway. That means anyone inside needs to be able to verify their own residency, Brandt said. If they can't, if the documentation doesn't check out, there can be an emergency removal pending investigation. He shrugged a slow and obscene gesture of performed unconcern, the shrug of a man who has arranged for the damage to land on someone else. Messy process, takes time, stressful for everybody involved. He let the last sentence sit there. And the world stopped. Not the way it stops in films. Not with a change in the light or a shift in the sound. But in the way it stops in actual moments of genuine extremity. A thickening of the air, a slowing of the world's movement. The specific physical sensation of something arriving with enough weight to alter the gravity of the morning. From inside the house, through the front door that stood between Raymond and everything, he could hear Sandra in the kitchen, the particular rhythm of her Saturday, the percussion of small domestic sounds he knew so completely and so specifically that he could have mapped her movements from them, the second cup of coffee being poured, the soft sound of her setting the mug on the counter, and underneath all of it, the half-unconscious hum of a song she didn't know she was singing, an old Aretha Franklin song that she had been humming since their second year of marriage and would probably hum for the rest of her life. He listened to those sounds, and he thought about Sandra with the specific, concrete precision of a man who loves someone in the particular detailed way that comes from 30 years of shared mornings. Not an abstraction, not a sentiment, but the actual woman. The specific person, the one who made the kitchen floor joke 20 minutes ago, and whose laugh was still living somewhere in the warm air of this driveway, the one who had waited 14 years with him to afford this house, the one who had never asked him to account for the cost of the Chevelle restoration, because she understood that some things a man builds are about more than the thing itself. He thought about what emergency removal looked like applied to a black woman inside a house in a wealthy neighborhood by an officer who had already demonstrated in the last 30 minutes that he would invent whatever pretext the situation required. He understood what it would look like, and what it would feel like, and what it would cost her in ways that no eventual exoneration could fully repair the specific damage of being removed from your own home. The story of it, the memory of it, the thing it would do to the particular dignity of a woman who had done nothing in her entire life except build something good and live in it. He stood perfectly still. He did not raise his voice. He did not move his hands. He let the full weight of what Brandt had just threatened settle through him the way cold settles through a building at night, slowly, completely into every room. And he stood in his driveway in his paint-splattered work pants, and he thought about the 3 complaint letters in Brandt's personnel file and the people who had written them and been told by the structure that their experience was insufficient for action, and he felt beneath everything the specific crystalline resolve that arrives when a man has been pushed past the point where accommodation is possible and has reached the place on the other side of it where something permanent needs to happen. This man had threatened Sandra. Not just today. He had threatened every person who had ever stood in a driveway like this one without a gold shield in their back pocket to change the calculation. This ends here. Not just today, not just Brandt alone, but the whole architecture of it. Fenwick's protection. The 3 dismissed complaints, the network of small accommodations and quiet authorizations that had let a man like this operate for 11 years with the comfortable certainty that he would never face a consequence serious enough to matter. All of it ends here, ends today, ends in a way that outlasts this driveway. Raymond felt his composure return, not the composed performance of a man managing his response, but the genuine settled composure of a man who has made a decision and knows what comes next. He looked at Kyle Brandt with eyes that gave away nothing, and he began. "Officer Brandt," Raymond said, and his voice carried at the level he used in courtrooms and precinct briefings, not shouting, not raised, but the particular projecting clarity of a man who is ensuring that every recording device and every witness in the vicinity has what they need. I am not resisting. I have not committed any crime. I am a resident of this property, and I have been entirely cooperative within the lawful bounds of what I am required to provide. I am formally requesting that a supervisor be dispatched to this location immediately. This stop is unlawful, and I am stating that clearly for the record. Brandt's jaw tightened. He reached for the radio on his shoulder this time to actually use it and keyed the mic. Dispatch, this is Unit 7 Foxtrot. I'm at 4117 Maplewood Court, Cedarwood Heights. I have an uncooperative male subject refusing to identify himself, requesting backup. He released the mic and looked at Raymond with an expression that was almost satisfied. You had your chance, he said. He stepped forward and grabbed Raymond's left arm, the grip rough and purposeful, the grip of a man who has done this before without lasting consequence, the kind of physical contact designed not to restrain, but to establish, to communicate through the body, what the words have failed to establish through authority. He attempted to turn Raymond toward the car. Raymond did not swing. He did not shove. He did not run. He planted his feet on the concrete of his own driveway and let his body become what it was: 220 pounds of muscle and 22 years of defensive tactics training, including 8 years as a certified instructor for the district, and he stood perfectly still, making no threatening movement of any kind, simply declining to be repositioned by a man who had no lawful basis for repositioning him. Stop resisting, Brandt said, his voice rising. I am standing perfectly still, Raymond said. Brandt's grip tightened. His other hand went to his belt, and what came off it was the extendable baton, and it caught the morning sun as he snapped it open with the sharp metallic sound that carries in residential neighborhoods in a way that is specific and unmistakable. A sound that belongs to a category of sounds that changes the quality of any morning it enters. Across the street, Calvin Tate stopped breathing. At the garden fence, Dorothy Reeves made a sound that was not quite a word. Something that came from a place below. Language from the place where 30 years of watching these situations get resolved badly converges with the visceral present-tense reality of watching it happen again, right now in front of the house of a man she has known for 6 years. The baton was in the air. Brandt adjusted his sunglasses the third time Raymond had seen him make that gesture, but this time the hand was not deliberate and composed. This time the hand was trembling slightly, but visibly the trembling of a man whose certainty has begun to fracture in ways he does not yet fully understand. Raymond looked at the baton. He looked at the hand holding it. He looked at Kyle Brandt's face, and he measured the distance between where they were and where this was going. And then he spoke, not loudly, but with a quality his voice had not carried before in this conversation. A weight that did not require volume to be felt, the weight of rank and years, and an authority that does not need to perform itself. It was the command voice, the voice that had directed homicide scenes and ordered surveillance operations and delivered the kind of news to victims' families that no one is ever ready to receive. The voice of a man who has given commands in situations where being ignored had consequences significantly higher than this one. "Lower the baton," Officer Brandt Raymond said. "Lower it. Now." Brandt hesitated. The hesitation lasted approximately 3 seconds, which is a very short time in most contexts, and an enormous time in this one, and in those 3 seconds, something cracked open in the driveway. A fracture in the surface of Brandt's certainty, something his body understood before his mind did the involuntary backward micro-shift of someone whose threat calculation has just encountered information it didn't account for. "You don't give orders here," Brandt said, but it came out smaller than he intended, and the smallness of it was audible to everyone in the cul-de-sac. "Lower the baton," Raymond said again. "And then you are going to stand still, and you are going to watch what I do next, and you are going to look carefully at what I produce." He held Brandt's eyes. "I am reaching into my back pocket. Keep your hands where they are." Raymond's right hand moved to his back pocket with the deliberate, choreographed visibility of a man who has communicated non-threat to armed and frightened people in high-stakes situations, before slowly, clearly narrating the movement as he made it. the hand traveling the entire distance in plain sight, every inch of it visible to Brant, to Calvin across the street, to Dorothy at the fence, to Gerald Odom at his window, to the phone in Calvin's hand and the 4K camera above Gerald's porch. His fingers closed around the worn leather of the badge wallet. He brought it out and held it in front of him at chest height, closed for 2 full seconds. He held it there and let Brant look at it. Let him register the worn leather. The rounded edges softened by years of pocket and hand, the particular density of something that has been carried for a long time, and he let him sit with the knowledge of what it was before he could see what was inside it, and he watched the specific quality of a man standing at a door he hadn't expected to find, and not yet knowing whether he should open it or run. Then Raymond's wrist turned and the wallet opened. The afternoon sun was at the precise angle to make the gold unavoidable. Not a glint, not a flash, but the deep, rich, unhurried intensity of metal that absorbs light, the way certain things absorb it, giving it back slower and warmer, and with a weight that cheap metal cannot replicate the weight of something earned over a very long time at a very specific cost. The Detective Sergeant's shield of the Garland City Police Department Major Crimes Division caught the July sun and held it. Beside the shield in the identification window, the department issued photo I.D. Raymond Holt, Detective Sergeant, Major Crimes Division, star number 447. The photograph showed a man in full-dress blues collar bearing commendation citations looking out from the image with the settled, composed authority of someone who has been in rooms far more serious than a driveway on a Saturday morning. The same face that was standing in paint-splattered work pants and a faded Howard University tee in front of Kyle Brant right now. Brant's brain performed the specific, agonizing arithmetic of receiving information that contradicts a foundational assumption. The eyes moving from the gold shield to the work pants, from the work pants to the ID photograph, from the photograph to the face, running the loop over and over, as though a sufficient number of repetitions might produce a different answer than the one the math kept returning. His mouth opened. No sound came. The color moved out of his face from the temples downward, a tide going out fast and total, leaving something gray and slack behind it, the specific pallor of a man whose blood has found other priorities, and his jaw continued to move with the disconnected automatic quality of machinery that hasn't received the signal to stop. And then his arm dropped. Not a controlled movement, not a decision. The arm simply fell, the way a load falls when you stop holding it up, the muscles going slack, because whatever signal had been maintaining their tension had just been interrupted at the source, and the baton swung against his leg, and he released it, and the steel rod hit the concrete of Raymond's driveway with a sound that rang through the cul-de-sac and reached Dorothy's hands on the fence rail and Calvin's phone across the street and traveled up through the oak trees and into the July morning air like the final word in a very long argument. Brant stared at the badge. He stared at it the way a man stares at something that has just restructured the architecture of the next several years of his life. "Sergeant," he said, and the word came out fractured 2 syllables carrying the sound of a door closing behind you when you discover for the first time that there is no handle on the inside. 2 police cruisers rounded the bend of Maplewood Court simultaneously, their engines arriving ahead of them. Doors swinging open, boot heels on asphalt. Sergeant Nora Fields emerged from the first cruiser, 51 years old. 24 years on the force, close-cropped silver hair, the face of someone who has seen enough Saturdays to know immediately what kind this was. And she crossed the driveway in the quick assessing stride of a senior officer reading a scene. And her eyes moved from Brant's pallor to the baton on the concrete, to the badge wallet open in Raymond's hand, and she stopped as though she had walked into something invisible. Sergeant Holt. She came to full attention, not the formal military kind, but the instinctive kind, the kind a career officer produces when facing rank and reputation that commands it without asking. "Sir." From the second cruiser, Officer Dennis Webb, 8 years on the force. Major Crimes Liaison. A man who had sat in more of Raymond's briefings than he could count climbed out, took in the scene in a single sweep, and stood at attention beside his vehicle without being told to. 2 officers both at attention for the man in the work pants. Brant looked at Fields. He looked at Webb. He looked at the badge and the ID photograph and then back at the face in the work pants and in the specific quality of his silence. In that moment, the silence of a man watching every exit close simultaneously. 11 years of what he had been, and what he had done, and what he had believed he could continue to do, collapsed into the space of a single irreversible second. Then on Brandt's own radio, the radio through which he had called for backup 14 minutes ago, the dispatcher's voice crackled out across the driveway in the morning air. Unit 7 Foxtrot copy. Also, Sergeant Holt, are you on scene at Maplewood Court? The department's own system addressing Raymond by rank over Brandt's radio, in Brandt's presence in front of the backup Brandt had called for himself. Dorothy Reeves slowly unclenched her hands from the top rail of the garden fence. Across the street, Calvin Tate lowered his phone. On the porch of the house at 4117 Maplewood Court, Sandra Holt had come outside barefoot on the painted boards, housecoat coffee cup held in both hands, and she was looking at her husband across the yard with the expression of a woman who understands everything that has happened, and everything that it cost, and everything that it means. And Raymond met her eyes and gave her the answer that didn't require words. The slow, slight nod, the particular downward tilt of the chin that meant, "We're all right. It's done." And he watched her shoulders drop 3 centimeters, the specific release of a woman setting down something heavy, and that 3 centimeters meant more to him than the badge and the shield and every commendation in his service file combined. Raymond closed the badge wallet. He slipped it back into his pocket. He looked at Kyle Brandt one last time with the steady, undeceived eyes of a man who has arrived somewhere he intended to arrive, and then he picked up the embroidered chamois cloth from the hood of the Chevelle and finished the front bumper. Sergeant Nora Fields approached Kyle Brandt with the professional, unhurried briskness of a 24-year veteran who has no interest in extending a scene any longer than the situation requires, and whose entire manner communicates without a single explicit word that the time for there being any version of this morning that ends differently has passed. She produced an evidence bag from her belt and held it open. "Officer Brandt, your weapon, your badge, and your radio, please." Brandt looked at the bag with the expression of a man running a final calculation, assessing the angles, looking for the exit, determining the probability that some combination of words or action might yet produce an outcome that is not this one. And whatever calculation he ran came back empty. His radio went into the bag first, his fingers stiff on it. His badge followed the standard silver patrol shield placed without ceremony alongside the radio, an object that had carried weight for 11 years and now sat in a clear plastic evidence bag on a driveway in Cedarwood Heights, its authority entirely and permanently revoked. Then the duty weapon accepted by Fields through secondary protocol, make, and serial noted on a small card. Raymond stood at the edge of his own driveway with the chamois cloth in one hand and the authority of his rank held quietly in the other, and he delivered the suspension instructions with the flat, precise clarity of a man who has given instructions in situations that required them to be understood correctly and understood once. He told Brandt that the suspension was effective immediately, that he was not to contact fellow officers about the events of the morning, that he was not to access departmental systems or files that union representation would be available to him, and that any other contact from the department should be directed to internal affairs. Then he paused and looked at Brandt directly. "Do you understand?" he said. "Yes," Brandt said, and the word was barely audible, the voice of a man trying to hold himself inside the present moment, because the larger architecture of what the present moment was leading toward was not yet something he could look at directly. From the garden fence, Dorothy Reeves spoke in the carrying, clear voice of a woman who spent 30 years ensuring that the back row heard what the front row heard, a voice that had never once required volume to reach every corner of a room. "We all saw it, Raymond," she said. "Every last bit of it, the whole street." It was not an offer of testimony, not yet. It was something more immediate and more essential than testimony. It was the specific declaration that a community makes when it has decided not to pretend it didn't see what it saw, and Raymond received it with the particular quiet gratitude of a man who understands exactly what it costs a person to say that out loud. "Thank you, Dorothy," he said. She nodded. Brant was escorted to Field's cruiser and walked with the disconnected, forward-focused gait of someone whose body is performing movement without direction, feet finding the path to the cruiser. Door by reflex because the mind was somewhere else entirely, somewhere in the accounting of what came next. The math of 11 years and 3 dismissed complaints and a body camera that had been running the entire time, and the specific irreversible sound of a baton hitting a driveway. It had no business being on. The cruiser door closed. Raymond picked up his sponge, dipped it in the bucket of soapy water, and began working the passenger door. From the garage, Sam Cooke was playing A Change Is Gonna Come, which struck Raymond in the quiet that followed the cruiser's departure as precisely, almost impossibly appropriate to the moment, and he almost smiled. He worked the sponge in slow, even circles. The morning settled back into itself. Brant called Dale Fenwick at 10:09 on Sunday morning, and Fenwick picked up on the second ring with the voice of a man who had already heard, which told Brant 2 things simultaneously: that Fields had called Fenwick the night before, and that Fenwick had spent the night deciding how he felt about it before deciding whether to pick up. Brant told the story the way he had rehearsed it overnight. The revised version, the version that had been worked and reworked in the apartment on the west side of Garland while the television played unwatched and the Sunday morning moved through its indifferent progress outside the window. The welfare check, the uncooperative subject, the physical resistance when he attempted a standard compliance maneuver, the baton deployed in the interest of officer safety. He said the subject then produced a police credential with the specific neutrality of a man trying to present the load-bearing element of the entire case as an incidental detail. "Silence on the line," Kyle Fenwick said, and his voice had none of the comfortable, practiced management it usually carried when he was working someone's problem. "Did you call the stop into dispatch before you activated your lights?" A pause. "I was going to call it in after I made contact." Another silence longer. "And your body camera, was it active when you got out of the cruiser?" "It was already on from prior patrol." "Right." Fenwick exhaled the particular exhale of a man doing financial accounting in real time and not liking the numbers. "Kyle, here's the situation as I currently understand it. You stopped a detective sergeant from major crimes on his day off on his own property, without dispatch notification, without documented probable cause, attempted to detain him, deployed your baton, and your written account of the encounter contradicts the body camera footage in at least 3 specific points." He paused. "And there is also apparently a neighbor's security camera footage that I received last night, 4K resolution timestamp overlay showing you sitting in your cruiser for 117 seconds watching him wash his car before you turned on your lights. No radio contact during that period." The statement sat between them with the weight of something that has no moving parts and nowhere to go. "I didn't know who he was," Brant said. "I understand that. That is not the part I'm most concerned about." Another pause, and in it, Brant could hear the specific quality of a man closing a door, not angry, just deliberate. "The union will file standard grievance procedures in the event of termination. That is what I am obligated to tell you. I am also obligated to tell you that based on what Fields is describing and based on the footage that is now in IA's hands, a grievance will not change the destination. It may extend the timeline. It will not change where you end up." He paused one final time. "Get a criminal defense attorney before the end of this week, Kyle. Don't talk to anyone from the department until you have one." The call ended. Brant set his phone on the couch cushion and watched the television without processing anything on it. On the same Sunday evening, 4 miles across Garland, Raymond Holt was in his home office with Brant's personnel file on the screen forwarded by Fields with a note that said, "Only thought you'd want to see the full picture." And he was reading the 3 closed complaint reports with the methodical, unhurried attention of a detective reading a case file, noting the name that appeared on the closing authorization for all 3, noting the consistency of language in Brant's own written accounts, noting the 45 to 60-day window from filing to closure on everyone. He picked up his phone and called District Attorney Patricia Cole at 9:45. Cole picked up on the third ring. "I expected to hear from you," she said. "Then you've seen the body camera footage. Flagged to my office this afternoon," she said, "along with the neighbor's security footage that arrived in IA's inbox tonight." A pause. "Raymond, tell me you want to pursue this properly." "All of it," Raymond said. "Not just Saturday. The 3 prior complaints, the authorization chain that closed them, the full pattern." He closed the personnel file on his screen. "All of it." Cole's voice took on the particular quality of a prosecutor who has just been handed a case she knows she can win. "I can have a grand jury convened within the month," she said. "Good," Raymond said. He turned off the desk lamp and sat in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the house settle around him, the familiar, specific quiet of the place he and Sandra had built, and then he went to bed. Gerald Odom spent Sunday evening the way retired contractors tend to spend Sunday evenings when they have identified a problem and have decided to address it methodically without drama, with the practical attention of someone who has spent 40 years understanding that identifying a problem and doing something about it are 2 separate steps, and that the second one is the one that matters. He sat at the desk in his front room with the security system monitor open on his laptop and worked backward through the Saturday footage from the wide-angle camera above his porch, the one that Sandra Holt had mentioned just last week. The new 4K system with the resolution sharp enough to read plates from the front steps. And he found what he was looking for at 9:47 in the morning. What the footage showed in the flat, comprehensive, entirely objective record of a camera that has no stake in the outcome and no reason to adjust what it captures, was this: a Garland City Police Department patrol cruiser turning onto Maplewood Court and coming to a slow stop at 9:47:12. The officer inside, visible clearly through the windshield, platinum blonde hair department uniform, did not exit the vehicle. He sat in the cruiser for 1 minute and 57 seconds watching Raymond Holt wash the Chevelle, making no radio transmission, taking no action, simply observing with the particular quality of observation that belongs to someone who has decided what he is going to do and is waiting until he feels like doing it. The emergency lights activated at 9:49 and 9 seconds. The officer exited at 9:49 and 22 seconds. His right hand was already near his duty belt before he reached the front of the cruiser. Gerald watched the full sequence twice. Then he copied the relevant segment to a flash drive, opened his email, and wrote a message to the Garland City Police Department's Civilian Oversight Board, with the subject line reading simply, "Re-incident at Maplewood Court. Saturday complete prior footage you may need." He attached the clip. He CC'd the Internal Affairs Division. He sent the email at 11:42 Sunday night. He did not call Raymond. He did not call anyone. He simply did the thing that needed to be done in the quiet, practical way of someone who has learned over 62 years that the most useful thing a witness can do is make sure the record is complete. The footage arrived in the IA inbox, while Brandt was in his apartment on the west side of Garland, telling himself, with the specific self-deception of a man who needs to sleep, that tomorrow would find an angle, that the union had resources, that the department had procedures, that there was always a version of events that could be managed into something survivable, because 3 times before the angle had been found and the angle had held. He did not know about the email Gerald Odom had sent at 11:42. He went to bed almost comfortable. The comfort did not last the morning. Raymond Holt walked through the glass doors of the Garland City Police Department Main District Precinct at 7:58 on Monday morning in his Class A dress uniform, brass buttons polished to mirror-finish trouser crease, sharp enough to measure a right angle. The gold detective sergeant's shield on his left breast catching the fluorescent lighting of the lobby and returning it with an unhurried absolute authority. He moved through the bullpen at shift change, normally raucous with the energy of officers coming and going this Monday, carrying the heavy, crackling undercurrent of a place where people are being very careful about what they say out loud, where conversations die as he passes, and officers, he has known for years, slow their pace and nod with the particular nod of people who have chosen their side and want that choice to be visible, and he walked through it without pausing and headed toward the internal affairs offices. He had a statement to give. He intended to give it with the same precision and objectivity he brought to every case file he had ever opened, because that was what the situation required, and what the situation required was what he intended to give it. Detective Lena Voss had been in internal affairs for 8 years, and she had developed over those 8 years the specific professional quality of someone who thinks about cases the way accountants think about numbers. Every figure has a source. Every source can be verified, and the gap between the claimed figure and the actual figure is always, without exception, more interesting than either one alone. She was 43 years old, compact, dark hair, cut close with eyes that operated on an independent evaluation system continuing to assess, while her face maintained the neutral professional register that 8 years of IA work had installed as a default setting. She had reviewed the body camera footage before Raymond arrived, and she had reviewed Gerald Odom's 4K security footage, and she had read Brandt's written incident report, and she had done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was not ambiguous. Raymond sat across from her in the second-floor conference room and gave his statement with the precision and objectivity of a detective narrating an investigation to a colleague, chronological stripped of editorial describing each of Brandt's actions and each of his own responses in the flat, accurate language of someone who is trying to make the record complete rather than make the record favorable. He did not embellish. He did not characterize Brandt beyond what the documented evidence supported. He described what had happened in the order it had happened with the professional economy of a man who understands that the facts presented clearly and completely are their own argument. When he finished, Voss reviewed her notes for a moment and then looked up. "The footage is consistent with your account across every specific point," she said. "Brandt's written statement contradicts the footage in 3 places that are not ambiguous." "I know," Raymond said. Downstairs in a different conference room, Brandt sat across from Voss's colleague with Dale Fenwick to his left, and Fenwick had the careful, drawn quality of a man who had spent the night converting his assessment of the situation from manageable to something else, and had arrived at the morning still not entirely comfortable with what the conversion had produced. Voss entered the room, opened her laptop without preamble, and played the body camera footage from the beginning while Brandt's written statement sat on the table in front of everyone. They watched Raymond's hands consistently visible throughout. They watched the plate return, come back clean. They watched Brandt decide to continue anyway. They watched the repositioning between Raymond and his own front door. They watched the holster hand the baton Raymond standing perfectly still through all of it. When the footage reached the moment of the badge reveal and the sound of the baton on the concrete, Brandt looked away from the screen. Voss paused the playback. She read his written statement aloud. The phrase, "The subject made a sudden aggressive movement toward me," and then she looked at him with the patient, unhurried expression of someone who has no interest in the answer, but is required to give him the opportunity to produce one. "The footage shows the subject standing still with both hands at his sides at the time of baton deployment," she said. "Would you like to revise your statement?" Brandt opened his mouth. Fenwick put a hand on his arm. "Kyle." The word was quiet, and it contained nothing of the practiced management and supportive competence that Fenwick had brought to 3 prior hearings. Nothing of the comfortable, smooth protection that had carried Brandt through 30 months of complaints and consequences, and emerged each time with his record intact. What it contained instead was the specific finality of a man who has done his accounting and arrived at a number he cannot make work. "Don't." Voss stepped out to give them a moment. The door closed with the quiet click of an institutional door in a building full of institutional doors. And in the silence that followed, Dale Fenwick looked at Kyle Brandt with the expression of a man who has been in this business long enough to know when he is looking at something that cannot be managed. Not this time. Not with this footage. Not with the footage that was already in IA's possession from a retired contractor's 4K camera system showing 117 seconds of documented surveillance before any lights went on or any radio call was made. He opened the folder on the table in front of him and looked at it for a moment without speaking, the way a man looks at paperwork when he is using the act of looking at it to create space between himself and what he has to say next. "The body camera footage is what it is," Fenwick said finally. "I have reviewed it. It is not ambiguous. Your written statement contradicts it in 3 specific points that any first-year prosecutor is going to walk to the jury on a Monday morning without breaking a sweat." He paused. "There is also the neighbor's footage which shows you stationary in your cruiser for 117 seconds before you activated your lights with no radio contact during that period. That footage is authenticated, time-stamped, and already in IA's hands." Brandt stared at the table. "The union files standard grievance procedures in the event of termination," Fenwick said, and his voice had the careful, precise quality of a man reading from a contract he is legally obligated to honor, but has no particular enthusiasm for. "I am obligated to tell you that. I am also obligated to tell you that based on the material currently in this file, a grievance will extend the timeline. It will not change the destination." He closed his folder. He straightened his tie with the brisk automatic gesture of a man preparing to leave a room. "Consult a criminal defense attorney before the end of the week," he said. "Don't contact anyone from the department until you have." He knocked twice on the conference room door, and when Voss re-entered, Fenwick picked up his briefcase and walked out without looking back at the man he had protected through 3 prior complaints, and would not be protecting. A 4th time would not look back. In fact, as he had stopped looking back at things that were no longer useful to him, and Kyle Brandt was definitively and entirely no longer useful to him. The termination hearing convened 2 days later in the administrative conference room on the 4th floor, a room designed for the specific business of institutional consequence, and Chief Diane Mercer sat at the head of the table, flanked by her deputy chief and the Civilian Oversight Board representative. And she read the body camera transcript with the focused attention of a woman who has formed a view and is examining the record for anything that would change it. And she found nothing that changed it. Raymond stood and spoke without notes, told them what the morning felt like. The Chevelle, the Saturday earned by 22 years, the habit of visible hands learned before long division. And then the moment Brandt looked toward his house and the word that followed removal, and what that word meant applied to Sandra by a man who had already shown he would manufacture whatever pretext he needed. "I am not asking for Officer Brandt's termination because he insulted me," Raymond said, his voice dropping to the register of an instrument that does not require amplification to fill a room. "I am demanding it because he is a danger to the citizens of this city, and I am asking that the full authorization chain for those 3 prior dismissed complaints be examined, not just the branch. The root." He sat down. The silence lasted 6 seconds, which is a very long time. Chief Mercer terminated Brandt's employment effective immediately, forwarded the request for permanent decertification, and stated that he would never wear a badge in this state. D. A. Patricia Cole from her chair along the side wall advised Brandt that a grand jury would convene Thursday, and that he should spend the next 72 hours in close consultation with his attorney. Brandt was escorted from the building and walked into the Tuesday afternoon that was entirely indifferent to his presence in it. The administrative conference room on the 4th floor of the Garland City Police Department had the particular quality of a space that has been designed for a specific and unpleasant function, and has been used for that function often enough that the function has become in some hard-to-name way embedded in the atmosphere of the room itself, the long mahogany table, the city seal on the wall, the specific quality of light that comes through institutional blinds on a weekday afternoon and lands without warmth on whatever it touches. Brandt's attorney Craig Alton presented his argument in 12 minutes of smooth, professionally constructed delivery, framing the incident on Maplewood Court as an overzealous but good-faith exercise of patrol discretion in an unfamiliar sector under ambiguous circumstances, a phrase that Alton had arrived at after 4 days of reviewing the body camera footage and had concluded carried approximately the structural integrity of an argument built on wishes rather than evidence, but which was the best available frame given the available material. Chief Mercer did not look up from the body camera transcript during those 12 minutes. She was reading it with the attention of someone who has formed a judgment and is doing the professional due diligence of making sure the judgment holds, and it held completely and without qualification through every page. Raymond stood and spoke without notes. He told them what the morning felt like starting from the beginning. The Chevelle on the concrete in the July light, the Saturday that belonged to him in the specific earned way that comes from 22 years of work and 14 years of mortgage payments and a life built by choice in a place he had been told implicitly and explicitly in 100 different ways over the course of his career that people who looked like him were not expected to inhabit. He told them about the habit of visible hands. He told them about the moment Brandt moved between him and his own front door, and the moment the word removal was spoken, and what that word meant applied to Sandra by a man who had already demonstrated in the preceding 30 minutes that he would manufacture whatever legal-sounding justification the situation required. And then he looked at Mercer directly and said the thing that needed to be said clearly and on the record in a room with witnesses in the language that institutions understand when they are being held to account. "I am not asking for Officer Brandt's termination because he insulted me," he said, his voice carrying with the flat, absolute authority of a man who has been saying true things in rooms like this for 22 years and has never once found the truth insufficient when it was delivered clearly enough. "I am demanding it because he is a danger to the citizens of this city. And I am asking that the full authorization chain for those 3 prior dismissed complaints be examined, not just the branch, the root." He sat down. The room was quiet for 6 seconds. Mercer terminated Brandt, effective immediately, forwarded the permanent decertification request, and stated plainly that he would never wear a badge in this state. D.A. Cole advised him from her position along the side wall that a grand jury would convene Thursday and that he should spend the next 72 hours with his attorney. As Brandt was escorted from the building, he walked the length of the corridor with the forward, disconnected gaze of someone whose body is moving by reflex, pushed through the glass door at the far end, and stepped out into a Tuesday afternoon that offered him nothing. The phone rang on a Wednesday morning while James Tate was eating breakfast before his Route 7 shift, 7 grain toast and black coffee. The Route 7 roster on the table beside his plate, the names of 42 kids in his familiar handwriting with small notes. Besides several of them, the notes that a driver makes when he has been running the same route for 9 years and has learned that paying attention to the small things is the job that matters underneath the job. The number on the screen was one he didn't recognize, a Garland area code, but not a number in his contacts, and he had the reflexive pause of someone who has spent enough years being disappointed by institutions that an unrecognized call from a government number does not produce optimism. He answered anyway. The woman on the line introduced herself as a member of the IA Civilian Review Unit, and she told him she was calling about a complaint he had filed 4 years ago, case number attached, and she asked if he had a few minutes, and James set down his toast and said yes. She told him the complaint was being reopened as part of a pattern investigation. She told him that his experience was not a closed file, it was evidence, and the investigation had developed to a point where his testimony would be material. She asked if he was willing to come in. James sat with the phone against his ear and felt the particular complicated sensation of a man receiving news he had stopped expecting, not joy exactly, not vindication, but something in the difficult territory between those two things, something that required a moment to name. He had spent 4 years not thinking about it, or thinking about it in the contained, controlled way you think about things. You have decided you cannot do anything about the complaint letter in the kitchen drawer, folded along the same creases it had carried for 4 years. The story he had stopped telling because telling it and being turned away was its own kind of damage. He had built a life around the decision to carry the thing rather than be slowed by it, and he had been reasonably successful at that, and he had told himself it was fine, and sometimes it had almost been fine. "Yes," he told the woman, "I'll come in." He sat across from Lena Voss 2 days later in a conference room that was smaller than he expected, and she had his original complaint on the desk in front of her. Not the dismissal letter, the original 3-page document he had typed and submitted. 8 days after that, Saturday morning in 2020, the one with his neighbor's contact information in the margin, and she had it open, and she was looking at it with the focused attention of someone who intends to understand what it says. James told her the story the way he had stopped telling it for 4 years. The truck in his driveway, the slow roll of the cruiser, the officer with the platinum blonde hair and the sunglasses and the grip on his arm. When James did not immediately step back, and the word resistance that followed a movement that was not resistance by any standard that James had ever been taught to understand. And while he talked, Voss took notes with the focused, precise attention of someone building something rather than just recording something. When he finished, she told him what she could tell him his complaint was evidence of a pattern, and the pattern now had enough documentation to pursue properly, and his voice was going to matter in what came next. James walked to his car in the parking lot of the Garland City PD and sat in it for several minutes without starting the engine, the roster for Route 7 on the passenger seat beside him. 42 names in his handwriting, and he thought about the letter in the drawer and the 4 years of carrying it, and then he called his sister. "You remember that thing I told you?" he said. "That thing I stopped talking about." "I remember," she said. "They're listening now," he said. The paper trail that Lena Voss was reconstructing in the internal affairs offices was not complicated. It was in fact notable for its simplicity, for the way the pattern presented itself clearly and without ambiguity. Once someone was actually looking at it, which was itself part of the story, because for 11 years no one had been required to look at it. 3 complaints filed across 4 years by 3 different black male civilians from 3 different parts of Garland. 3 complaint investigations, each opened with the standard acknowledgement language, each assigned a case number, each reviewed and closed within 45 to 60 days. On each of the 3 closing authorizations, the same signature Dale Fenwick Police Union representative with the same formulaic closing language. Insufficient grounds for formal disciplinary proceedings applied to situations that Voss reviewing them now with the body camera footage from Maplewood Court, as context could see, were structurally identical. Manufactured suspicion escalation when challenged. Physical contact and a written incident report that described the civilian's behavior in language calibrated to shift responsibility and close the file. The unspoken formula that had kept the system running was not difficult to identify once you were looking for it. Suspicion plus a clean record, plus an officer with good numbers in the right precinct, equals a complaint that never reached the stage where someone with authority was required to act on it. It was the formula of an arrangement that had been working smoothly for long enough that the people operating it had stopped thinking of it as an arrangement and had started thinking of it as the natural order of things. The emails were already being quietly deleted from internal servers by the time Voss began requesting records reports with adjusted dates, internal communications that had previously recommended Brandt for commendation, now suddenly unavailable. A quote of praise from a command board meeting in 2021 scrubbed from open archives. The deletions were in Voss's professional assessment, not the behavior of people who believed the file was going to be closed again. They were the behavior of people who had looked at the body camera footage and Gerald Odom's 4K recording and done their own arithmetic. 2 colleagues who had co-signed Brandt's complaint dismissals found their own files opened by the oversight inquiry. A precinct captain who had described Brandt as an asset to proactive community policing in a 2022 evaluation declined through his attorney to participate in voluntary interviews. A union board member who had attended Brandt's 2020 commendation ceremony abruptly resigned, citing personal reasons on the same morning the subpoenas went out. The network was dissolving not from pressure exactly, not from anyone ordering it to dissolve, but with the specific self-protective efficiency of people who have decided each privately and without coordination that the safest available move is to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the last 11 years. And Dale Fenwick, the man whose signature appeared on every closing authorization, received the subpoena on a Thursday afternoon in the parking garage of the building where he kept his office, and he sat in his car and read it with the careful, slow attention of a man who wants to make sure he understands precisely what it says before he decides what to do about it. His phone was on the passenger seat. There were people he could call, people who 6 weeks ago would have picked up and helped him think through the angles. He looked at the phone. He thought about the footage that was now in Patricia Cole's possession, the footage from the driveway and the footage from Gerald Odom's porch, and he thought about the 3 complaints and the 3 closing authorizations and his own signature on every single one of them. He did not make any calls. He put the subpoena in his briefcase, started his car, and drove out of the parking garage into the Thursday afternoon, and what was waiting for him on the other side of this, he understood with the flat, unsentimental clarity of a man who has spent his entire career managing consequences for other people, was entirely and exclusively his own. Dorothy Reeves submitted her written statement to the Civilian Oversight Commission on a Tuesday morning, not just the incident she had witnessed on Maplewood Court 3 weeks earlier, but 4 other stops she had seen on this street over the previous 5 years. Different officers, different pretexts, the same essential structure repeated with the comfortable regularity of something that had never been required to justify itself. She wrote the statement in longhand at her kitchen table with the careful precision of a woman who spent 30 years grading written work and understands the difference between a statement that is clear and a statement that merely sounds clear, and then she typed it, and then she printed it and signed it and drove it to the commission office herself because she wanted to make sure it arrived. In the car on the way home, she allowed herself the acknowledgement she had been avoiding. She had seen the pattern before this. She had seen it twice in the years before this, and had told herself each time that submitting a complaint would go nowhere, that the mechanism for hearing these things was the same mechanism that had declined to hear them before, and she had waited, and the waiting had been a form of complicity she had not wanted to name, but was naming now. She did not share this with anyone. She simply drove home and made a cup of tea and sat at the window that looked out over her garden and the cul-de-sac beyond it, and she let the acknowledgement sit with her without trying to make it into anything other than what it was. Calvin Tate's footage had been authenticated and entered into the record 16 years old Dorothy's grandson, the kid with the phone across the street, who had started recording at the moment Brandt repositioned between Raymond and his own front door, and who had held the camera steady for 14 minutes without stopping. He had sent Raymond a letter 3 weeks after the incident, careful handwriting on notebook paper. 5 paragraphs in which he said that the morning had clarified something for him that he had been trying to identify for a while, and that he was applying to pre-law programs in the fall. Raymond had written back. He had told Calvin that what he had done with the phone that morning was not a small thing, that bearing witness clearly and steadily is one of the most important things a person can do, and that he hoped Calvin would bring that quality to whatever room he chose to work in for the rest of his life. The 3 prior complainants were formally notified that their cases were reopened and that their experiences would be heard. James Tate and 2 other men whose files had been in the dismissal pile for between 2 and 5 years, whose complaints had been assigned case numbers and then assigned to the specific silence that follows a case number when the system has decided not to look at it anymore. The notifications arrived by certified mail, and each one contained a line that the department had not previously included in any correspondence about these cases. Your experience is evidence. You will have the opportunity to be heard. James Tate read that line in his kitchen before his morning route, standing at the counter with his coffee, and he read it twice, and then he put the letter on the table beside his Route 7 roster, and he went to work. The word that arrived in his mind that morning, quietly, without fanfare, without any particular ceremony, was finally, and it stayed there, settled and certain for the rest of the day. The Garland County Courthouse had acquired by the morning that State v. Brandt was scheduled to begin jury selection, the particular charged atmosphere of a civic event that has outgrown the dimensions of the building it was designed for satellite trucks, occupying most of the plaza camera positions from 3 national news organizations flanking the limestone steps. A documentary crew that had been following the case for 2 months negotiated down to a single stationary position near the main entrance, an arrangement that served no one's interests and everyone's needs adequately. Kyle Brandt sat at the defense table in courtroom 3B and looked nothing like the officer who had turned onto Maplewood Court on a Saturday morning in July. He had lost somewhere between 15 and 20 pounds since the driveway, and his face had the drawn, redrawn quality of a man who has been living inside a very specific kind of dread for 4 months and has run out of ways to stop thinking about it. The charcoal suit his attorney Craig Alton had advised him to purchase was technically correct for the occasion and could do nothing about the posture, which was simply gone. The jaw that had looked engineered for argument sat loose and purposeless, and the eyes that had moved through spaces with scanning confidence now tracked the courtroom with the careful, reactive movement of someone assessing risk from the defensive position rather than asserting authority from the dominant one. Alton had studied the available footage more than 40 times and had arrived at a strategy he understood was not going to produce acquittal but might produce a hung jury, not contest. What happened, the footage was the footage, but reframe what it meant. An off-duty officer in plain clothes who deliberately concealed his rank throughout the encounter. A superior officer who chose not to defuse a situation he had the training and authority to defuse at any moment. A junior officer trying to do a job in circumstances that were not what they appeared. The problem with the strategy, as Alton had noted privately after his 41st viewing of the footage, was that the footage was there, and it showed everything. And everything it showed went in the wrong direction. D.A. Patricia Cole opened for the state with the brisk, factual confidence of a prosecutor who does not feel the need to make a case appear larger than it is, because it is already everything. No emotional language. No rhetorical scaffolding. The documented sequence of events, the body camera footage, Gerald Odom's 4K recording, and the 3 prior dismissed complaints admitted as pattern evidence over Alton's objections by Judge Warren Hines. A man with the precise, unhurried judicial demeanor of someone who has heard a great deal of argument across a long career and is not moved by volume or by confidence that is not supported by facts. The body camera footage played for the 12 jurors without commentary from Cole. They watched Raymond's hands consistently visible, consistently still, throughout every exchange. They heard each escalation in Brandt's voice, and each measured precise response from Raymond. They heard the welfare check threat, and 2 jurors in the back row made small, involuntary movements in their seats, the particular physical response of people processing something their bodies have identified as genuinely wrong before their minds have finished the sentence. Cole let the footage finish and then let the silence stand for 10 seconds, which is a long time in a courtroom when 12 people are sitting with what they have just seen. Then she began. Raymond walked to the witness stand on the second day of the trial in his Class A dress uniform, the same uniform he had worn to every institutional proceeding since the morning in the driveway, with the measured, contained pace of a man who has been in rooms like this for 22 years, and has never found the experience of telling the truth in them particularly difficult. In the gallery, Sandra had found his hand before he stood, and he had held it for a moment before releasing it, and that moment was the whole of what he needed. He swore the oath with the steady, carrying voice of a man who has delivered briefings and scene assessments, and the kind of news that no one is ready to receive across 2 decades, and he sat in the witness chair with the particular posture of someone who has been in chairs like this before and has always told the truth in them. Under Cole's direct examination, he narrated the events of July 14th with the precision and objectivity of a detective describing an investigation to a review panel. Not his investigation, but one he had been present for the way detectives sometimes find themselves present for things before they understand fully what they're witnessing. He described each exchange, each of Brandt's actions, each of his own decisions in the flat, accurate language of someone whose primary obligation is to the record. Near the end of direct, Cole asked the question that the courtroom had been waiting for. "Sergeant Holt," she said, "you've described maintaining significant composure throughout a confrontation that involved an officer pointing a weapon at you, attempting to physically restrain you, and threatening to have your wife removed from your home. Why didn't you simply identify yourself as a police officer at the beginning of the encounter?" Raymond considered the question for a moment with the genuine consideration of a man who wants to answer it correctly because the answer is important. "Because I am a citizen first," he said. "I have been a citizen of this city my entire life. I was a citizen before I was a police officer, and I will be one long after. A citizen should not need a badge in their back pocket to be treated with basic dignity on their own property on a Saturday morning." He paused. and I chose to wait because I wanted to understand what I was dealing with. I know the difference between an officer who makes an error in judgment and an officer who operates with the sustained, deliberate conviction that certain people do not require the protections that other people receive without question. Officer Brandt was not confused. He was not uncertain. He made a series of deliberate choices from the moment he turned onto my street without calling dispatch to the moment he raised his baton, and every one of those choices was made with the confidence of a man who had made them before without consequence. Cole nodded and sat down. Craig Alton approached for cross-examination with the energy of a man who has spent 3 months preparing for this specific witness and has the professional honesty to understand privately that what he is about to do is less likely to help his client than to demonstrate to the jury that the case against his client has no weaknesses he can effectively exploit. He tried 5 different approaches over 90 minutes. He attempted to frame Raymond's physical presence as inherently intimidating. He suggested that Raymond's legal knowledge was a form of deliberate provocation designed to produce the outcome that followed. He argued that Raymond, with his training and his rank, could have ended the confrontation at any moment, and chose not to for reasons that served his own interests. Raymond answered each question with the same measured factual clarity, without anger, without retreat, without performing anything that was not simply the truth delivered at the appropriate pace for someone who is in no hurry and has nothing to hide. By the time Alton sat down, he looked like a man who had been climbing a hill for 90 minutes and found another hill waiting at the top. Raymond stepped down from the stand, walked back through the well of the court, and took his seat beside Sandra. She leaned very slightly against his shoulder for a fraction of a second. He noticed, and it was enough. James Tate walked to the witness stand with the careful, practiced composure of someone who has been rehearsing steadiness for weeks. Not because the story he was going to tell was unfamiliar, but because he had spent 4 years not telling it, and the act of choosing to tell it in this room under oath in front of a jury and a courtroom full of people who were going to form opinions about what it meant required a specific kind of preparation that was different from simply remembering what had happened. He was 44 years old, school bus driver, Route 7, Garland Unified School District, 9 years on the same route. He stated this for the record without any particular emphasis because it was simply what was true. Under Cole's examination, he described his Saturday morning 4 years ago, the truck in the driveway of his duplex, the same slow roll of the patrol cruiser, the same platinum blonde officer with the same sunglasses and the same escalating sequence of manufactured suspicion and manufactured justification, and the grip on his arm when he did not immediately comply with an instruction he had no legal obligation to comply with, and the word resistance that followed a movement that was not resistance by any standard he had ever been taught. He described filing the complaint 8 days later, typed detailed with his neighbor's contact information included. He described the letter that arrived 6 weeks after that. He described going to the community liaison office and the man there who had been sympathetic and who had told him these things moved slowly and whom he never heard from again. And then he described what it had cost him, not the humiliation of that Saturday morning, because humiliation you can metabolize and move through, but the specific harder damage of trying to use the mechanism that was supposed to address these things and being told that his experience was insufficient for the mechanism to engage with the erosion that followed from being disbelieved or believed but turned away, which was its own kind of diminishment that was harder to name and slower to recover from. When he finished, James Tate reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper, worn along the creases, the paper soft with the particular texture of something handled often in private moments, and then put carefully away. He placed it on the railing of the witness box. It was his original complaint letter. He had carried it for 4 years. He did not explain it. He did not need to explain it. In the gallery, the 2 other prior complainants sat with the still focused attention of people for whom this trial was about something larger and older and more essential than the formal charges on the docket, and neither of them looked away. Craig Alton declined to cross-examine. The body camera footage played twice during the trial, once at normal speed, and once slowed frame by frame so that the jury could see in granular detail what had happened on the driveway at 4117 Maplewood Court on a Saturday morning in July, and Gerald Odom's 4K footage was authenticated, admitted over Alton's objections, and shown to the jury in full resolution, a Garland City Police Department patrol officer sitting in his cruiser for 117 seconds, watching a man wash a car before activating his emergency lights with no radio contact during that period hand near his duty belt before he reached the front of the vehicle. The jury watched with the concentrated, deliberate attention of people who understand that what they are forming in this room will have consequences, and several of them were visibly doing the arithmetic as the footage played the specific mental work of reconciling what they were seeing with what they had been told in Brandt's written account. And the arithmetic was not difficult, and the results were not ambiguous. The 4 days of the trial had not been kind to Alton's strategy, and by the 4th day the desperation was visible in the way an experienced attorney's desperation shows. Not in any single thing he said, but in the aggregated quality of his choices, the reaching for angles that didn't hold the cross-examinations that produced answers more damaging than the questions had anticipated the general sense of a man working harder and harder on a structure that was not going to stand. His final card was putting Brandt on the stand. Brandt took the oath with a hand that visibly trembled. He sat in the witness chair with the posture of a man carrying something very heavy, and under Alton's direct examination he wept genuine tears. Or what appeared to be genuine tears, the body's response to 4 months of sustained dread, finally finding an outlet in the most public room he had ever occupied, and he described the morning as fear as a patrol officer trying to do his job in an unfamiliar district under circumstances that had gotten away from him. And then in a low voice he said something that had not appeared in any prior statement, something that arrived in courtroom 3B, with the weight of unexpected things arriving in enclosed spaces, a pulse of changed air, a collective micro-movement, the sound of 12 people shifting slightly in their chairs. He claimed that Raymond, just before the footage's audio picked up clearly, had leaned toward him and told him he was going to take his gun. The statement landed. 2 jurors in the front row were frowning not with rejection, but with the specific frown of people who have been certain about something and are now for the first time genuinely uncertain about it, and that uncertainty was visible and real, and the kind of thing that Alton had been trying to produce for 4 days and had not managed to produce until this moment. In the gallery, Raymond watched Brandt make the claim with the quiet, still attention of a man watching a trap close around someone who built it themselves, because he knew what was in Cole's file, and he knew what Tamara Reeves had told Cole 3 weeks ago, and he knew what Cole was holding in the folder on her table, and he understood that the next few minutes were going to settle the question that Brandt had just with his last available lie put back into play. Cole stood. "Your Honor," she said with the calm of someone who has been waiting for exactly this, the state calls a rebuttal witness. Kyle Brandt's face drained of the last color it had retained over 4 days of trial at the moment. Cole spoke Tamara Reeves' name, and the draining was complete and visible from the gallery and from the jury box, and from the defense table where Craig Alton placed his pen carefully on his legal pad and did not pick it up again. Officer Tamara Reeves was 28 years old and had been a patrol officer for 3 years, and she walked down the aisle of courtroom 3B with the particular deliberate composure of someone who has made a decision she is going to see through, regardless of what it costs her professionally, and has been rehearsing the steadiness required to see it through for weeks, and intends to maintain that steadiness in this room no matter what happens. She took the oath. She sat down. She looked at a point slightly above and between both counsel tables, not at Brandt, not at the jury, not at Cole, and she kept her hands flat on the railing of the witness box with the conscious stillness of someone who has decided where their hands should be and is keeping them there. Cole approached and asked her to describe her relationship with Brandt, and she described it. They had served together at the East Side Precinct before his transfer patrol overlap for 8 months, the ordinary professional proximity of 2 officers working the same sector. Officer Reeves Cole said, Could you describe a conversation you had with Officer Brandt approximately 3 days before the incident on Maplewood Court? Reeves took a measured breath. She had asked herself in the weeks between that locker room conversation and this courtroom many times whether she had acted quickly enough, whether she should have reported what she heard immediately rather than carrying it while the incident on Maplewood Court unfolded, and then the termination, and then the grand jury indictment, and she had arrived through that process at the clear answer that what she had done was recorded, and the recording was in the sealed evidence bag on Cole's table, and the recording was what mattered. I was in the precinct locker room finishing a shift, she said. Officer Brandt was talking about his transfer to Cedarwood Heights. He said the sector was too quiet. He said he was bored. He said that rich neighborhoods get complacent and that he intended to, his exact words, shake the trees over there to see what fell out. She paused. He said he knew exactly what kind of people to look for. She said the next part the way she had rehearsed saying it clearly, without additional commentary, without inflection, that would make it anything other than a factual account. He had used a racial slur. He had said those people didn't belong in houses like that. He had said that all he needed was one excuse to his exact words, hook one up and make a headline for himself. The gallery sound was immediate and involuntary, a murmur that Judge Hines's gavel reduced to silence, with 2 quiet taps. Alton was on his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay. No corroboration, no documentation. Cole reached into her folder with the particular unhurried composure of a prosecutor who has been waiting for this objection since the morning she received a phone call from Tamara Reeves and listened to what Tamara Reeves had recorded on her personal device while lacing her boots in the far corner of the East Side Precinct locker room 3 days before a Saturday morning in July. She produced a small silver personal audio recorder in a sealed evidence bag. The statement is not hearsay, Cole said, because Officer Reeves, disturbed by what she heard, had the presence of mind to press record on her personal device when Officer Brandt began speaking. The state has a complete audio recording of the conversation authenticated by the State Crime Laboratory voice print verified against known samples from Officer Brandt's department-issued body camera and ready for the jury. Alton sat down, not slowly, not with any visible performance of defeat, but with the specific quiet deflation of a man who has just finished a race and knows the time without being told it. The recording played through the courtroom's audio system, 38 seconds. Ambient locker room noise underneath it. The sound of Brandt's voice at the uncensored pitch of a man speaking to someone he believed to be an ally, saying everything that Tamara Reeves had described on the stand, with the comfortable, casual ease of someone who has never been required to keep these thoughts out of his voice. The courtroom was absolutely still. When the recording ended, Brandt had both hands flat against the armrests of the witness chair face, angled downward. The tears from Alton's direct examination long dried, and what remained was not grief and was not anger, but the specific hollow expression of a man watching the last credible account of himself collapse in real time in front of 12 people who were going to decide what it meant. "No redirect, Your Honor," Alton said. He was not pretending anymore. There was nothing left to pretend with. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 41 minutes. The foreperson. Carol Reyes, 44 years old, a logistics manager who had been quietly and methodically the most analytically precise person in the deliberation room. From the first hour, read the verdict with the clear, even voice of someone who understands that the reading of a verdict is itself a kind of act, that the tone in which it is delivered carries information alongside the words, and who has decided that the appropriate tone is none at all clear, direct, unadorned by anything that would make the words more or less than what they are. On the count of aggravated assault under color of authority, guilty. On the count of false imprisonment, guilty. On the count of felony civil rights deprivation, guilty. The gallery produced a sound that was not quite a cheer and not quite crying, and lived in the necessary difficult space between the two. The sound of people for whom the verdict is about something larger and older than the specific charges, for whom the 3 words had been preceded by years of not hearing them applied to situations like this one, and who were receiving them now with the particular complicated emotional quality of people who are relieved and exhausted and uncertain how to be either. Judge Hines brought the gavel down once, not harshly. He ordered the jury to step out for formal sentencing procedures and then looked at Brandt for a long moment before he spoke. "Mr. Brandt," he said, abandoning the neutral judicial register for something that was not quite personal, but was not entirely institutional. "Either in 11 years on this bench I have presided over cases involving men who did terrible things for reasons that were comprehensible, even understandable poverty desperation, the specific damage that difficult lives create. I have rarely presided over a case in which the evidence suggests that the harm caused was a product of sustained deliberate choice, protected by institutional accommodation." He placed his pen on the bench. "You were trusted with the most significant responsibility a democratic society confers on its agents. You treated that trust as a license." He rose. "Sentencing in 3 weeks." Raymond and Sandra walked out through the side gallery exit and into the October afternoon, the light different from July. Thinner, the shadows longer, the air carrying the particular quality of a season that has turned while you weren't paying attention to it. Sandra took his arm. "How do you feel?" she asked. He thought about it honestly, the way he tried to think about important questions, not for the answer that was expected or the answer that was reassuring, but for the answer that was true. "Like something that was supposed to happen finally happened," he said. "And like there's a lot of work left before it matters the way it needs to." She squeezed his arm and they walked. Near the foot of the courthouse steps, James Tate was standing in the October afternoon, not waiting for anyone specifically, just standing in the air of the day, the way a man stands when he has been inside a room that was important for a long time and has just come out of it and needs a moment before he decides where to go next. His eyes found Raymond's across the small distance between them, and James gave a single nod. Not small, not performative. The full, deliberate nod of a man who means it, and Raymond returned it, the same quality, the same weight, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that words would have added to what the two nods already contained. They turned and walked to their cars in the October afternoon in opposite directions, and that was enough. 3 weeks after the verdict on a Thursday morning, with thin November rain falling on the courthouse steps, Judge Warren Hines sentenced Kyle Brandt to 9 years in the state penitentiary, no plea reduction, no early parole consideration before the mandatory minimum, and stated for the record that permanent decertification from law enforcement in any capacity in this state or any state had been finalized the previous week. The restitution order for James Tate and the 2 other prior complainants was filed simultaneously in the civil division. 3 separate men who had submitted their experiences to a mechanism that had declined to hear them, and who were now at minimum being acknowledged by the system as having been right about what had happened to them. As the marshals placed cuffs on Brandt's wrists and turned him toward the holding door, he looked back across the courtroom, one final time with the searching look of a man who needs to locate something but cannot identify what he is looking for. And Raymond met his eyes and gave him nothing, not triumph and not pity, and not the performance of either, just the steady, clear gaze of a man who understands that consequence is not justice's emotion. It is justice's arithmetic, the necessary accounting of a debt that had been accumulating for 11 years and was now at last being settled. The door closed. Kyle Brandt was processed into Hartfield State Correctional Facility on a Wednesday evening in November, assigned to protective custody because of his prior law enforcement status, and placed in a concrete cell measuring 8 by 10 feet with a steel platform bed and a stainless steel sink and a narrow window set high in the wall that admitted a strip of sky that changed color with the time of day and served as the room's only connection to the world outside the building. The door closed with the specific mechanical certainty of a door designed to stay closed. In protective custody, he had 23 hours a day in the cell. In the first days, he tried to hold on to the legal narratives, the appeal, the contestable evidence admission, the angles that Alton had mentioned in passing, and he held on to them the way a man in water holds on to a floating thing. Not because it is sufficient, but because holding it uses energy that would otherwise be occupied by the alternative. But the cell dissolved the narratives he brought into it one by one, with the patient indifference of a small space and a great deal of time, and what was left when the narratives were gone was simply him without the badge, and without the performance, and without 11 years of institutional accommodation to stand between him and what he actually was. He replayed the driveway compulsively, Raymond's hands always visible, the gold shield opening in the afternoon sun, Fields coming to attention, the baton on the concrete. He had told himself for 11 years that he was doing a job. The cell had a different teaching. On a Wednesday afternoon, 6 weeks after his arrival, a young corrections officer directed him to collect a mop for his corridor shift and told him without looking up from the clipboard what tiles he was responsible for. Not unkindly, not cruelly, simply with the complete professional indifference of a man for whom this task and this person required exactly the same level of attention as everything else. Brant took the mop. At the far end of the corridor, through a reinforced window, the wall-mounted television was running a local news segment. He recognized the conference room. He recognized the man in the gray suit at the head of the table, Raymond Holt, addressing the newly formed Independent Civilian Oversight Commission with the unhurried authority of a man who has decided this is the work he intends to do. Brant watched for 20 seconds before the officer at the other end of the hall told him to keep moving. He kept moving. He thought about James Tate. He thought about the letter James had placed on the witness box railing, folded along 4-year-old creases carried that long. He thought about what it meant that James had carried it instead of throwing it away. That somewhere inside the 4 years of being told the mechanism would not engage James had kept the evidence of what had happened because some part of him had believed that eventually someone would look. The recognition that settled through Brant in the corridor was colder and more permanent than guilt, harder to metabolize than remorse. It was simply the weight of what he had actually done and what it had actually cost the people he had done it to. And 9 years was a very long time to carry it, and he had not yet begun. In late April, on a morning with the specific quality of light that belongs to spring, before it has acquired the weight of summer cleaner and more direct, carrying the particular promise of warmth that hasn't yet turned into its own kind of burden. Raymond Holt was in his driveway at 8:15, and the work pants had survived everything. They had survived 3 garage renovation projects and a grass-staining incident and 1 ill-fated attempt at hardwood floor refinishing and a confrontation with a patrol officer and a termination hearing and a felony trial and the 9 months that followed all of that, and they had achieved through the accumulation of all this history a kind of threadbare mythology, paint-splattered canvas that had been present for more of Raymond Holt's life than most of the things he owned. The Howard University tee was on its last structural season. The canvas sneakers were the same pair, the sapphire green paint stripe on the right toe unchanged. The Chevelle sat on the concrete in the April light, and Raymond had filled the bucket and soaked the wash mitt and was working the hood in the slow, methodical spiral that ensures even coverage starting at the center and working outward the same pattern he had been using for 6 years. The radio in the open garage playing Marvin Gaye, What's Going On, which had come on mid-album and which Raymond had not selected specifically, but which seemed, when it registered in his peripheral consciousness, to be there on exactly the terms of things that arrive at the right time. Dorothy Reeves appeared at the edge of the driveway at 8:45 with 2 mugs of coffee. No tray, no ceremony, just 2 mugs carried the way a neighbor carries coffee to a neighbor on a Saturday morning when she has decided that this is what the morning calls for. She handed one to Raymond, and they stood together at the edge of the driveway in the comfortable, unhurried silence of people who have said a great deal to each other over the years and understand that the present moment does not require filling. After a while, Dorothy said she had submitted the written statement to the commission, not just the Maplewood Court incident, but the 4 other stops she had witnessed on this street over the previous 5 years. Different officers, the same structure. She said she should have done it sooner. Raymond looked into his coffee. He told her that what she had provided had closed a gap in the pattern that Voss's unit was building, the full picture that the stops and the demographics and the complaint histories were being mapped, and that her statement was evidence of something that had needed to be documented. and was now documented. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in the specific way you mean thank you when you're thanking someone for something that cost them something. She nodded. Raymond set his coffee down and picked up the embroidered chamois cloth from the Chevelle's hood, the one with the Howard bison in the corner, his daughter's birthday gift, the one he had set down so carefully before everything began on that July morning, and he folded it and returned it to its place, a gesture so small and so private that only he knew what it meant, and what it meant was that the thing that had been interrupted was finished now, and the morning was his again. Sandra came out with cornbread warm from the oven barefoot on the porch boards, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she came down the steps and across the yard and handed the plate to Dorothy first, and the three of them stood together in the April morning in the driveway of the house at the end of Maplewood Court, the midnight green Chevelle reflecting them in the chrome bumpers in the small, curved, compressed way that chrome reflects everything three people in a driveway on a Saturday that belonged to them. Raymond had declined the lieutenant promotion for the third time. He had accepted the Oversight Commission chairmanship 5 months ago, and it was the slow, grinding, unglamorous work of someone making something better by increments 8 documented points in the complaint review process, where cases like Brandt's could have been caught earlier 5 formal recommendations submitted to the board, 3 of them already approved and in the process of being implemented. Dorothy said the neighborhood felt different this spring. Raymond thought about all the stops that had happened on streets like this one, the ones he had been told about and the ones he hadn't, the people who had filed complaints and been turned away, and Calvin Tate, who had written that the morning of July 15th had clarified for him what he wanted to do with his life. Maybe Raymond said, "We'll see what the next spring looks like." Dorothy took a piece of cornbread from the plate and nodded the nod of a woman who has been watching this neighborhood for 23 years and has decided that what she is watching now is different from what came before, and that the difference is worth protecting. The detective sergeant's shield sits in its velvet-lined box on the mantel in the front room of the house at the end of Maplewood Court, between a photograph from his youngest daughter's wedding and a small framed card his elder daughter made when she was 7. Unsteady crayon letters on construction paper that read, "My dad is the best policeman," and Raymond has kept it for 40 years. Not because it is literally true, but because it is the truest thing he has ever been given to aspire to. And because aspiration is not a childish thing, it is the only honest relationship a person can have with the distance between what they are and what they are trying to become. The badge beside it is not a trophy, and not a monument. It is simply the object that caught the afternoon sun in a driveway on a July Saturday, and ended 11 years of protected harm by existing carried in the pocket of paint-splattered work pants, by a man who understood that the confrontation itself was never the point, and that the point was always what could be built from it. Somewhere around the bend of the cul-de-sac, the training wheel bicycle is attempting the slope again, the same aluminum frame scraping the same asphalt in the same unsteady, determined arcs that filled the background of the July morning when everything changed. The same refusal to stop. That is not stubbornness, but simply the honest persistence of someone who has decided that mastery is not optional, and that falling down is part of the process, and not an argument against continuing. The child does not know they are an echo of that morning. The child is simply practicing. This is the sound Raymond listens to when he needs to remember what the work is. For not the hearings, not the commendations, not the commission meetings on Tuesday mornings, but this, the sound of someone trying at something they have not yet mastered and refusing to stop in the driveway of a neighborhood that is learning slowly and imperfectly and without any guarantee of success to be better than it was. He works the chamois over the chrome of the rear bumper in slow, even circles, the soap lifting the last of winter from the metal, the Aretha Franklin coming through the garage radio with the particular irreducible joy of a song that has never once suggested it might run out of reasons to be felt, and the mockingbirds are arguing in Dorothy's oak tree, and the morning is warm, and the commission meeting is Tuesday, and there are 7 more recommendations to submit, and the work is not finished, because the work was never going to be finished by one morning in one driveway. but one morning in one driveway is where it started, and the badge is on the mantle, and Sandra is inside, and the Chevelle is clean. And this Saturday morning, this particular ordinary, entirely earned Saturday morning belongs to him completely and always did and always will. If this story stayed with you, if the sound of that baton hitting the concrete stayed with you, or Dorothy's coffee, or the letter James Tate carried for 4 years, or the 38 seconds of a man's own voice undoing everything, tell us in the comments what moment got you. We read every one. And if you believe that the truth deserves a room to be heard in, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. The next story is already on its way.